Hey everyone, welcome back to Toast and Topics.
Before getting started, we wanted to remind all of our audience to check out our YouTube channel and like and subscribe there.
And additionally, we wanted to wish all the mothers that may be listening to this podcast episode a very happy Mother's Day. I hope my mom is listening to this episode. And if you are, Mom, thank you for everything that you do for me and for being our biggest fan.
Amen.
Today's episode will be focused on a topic that has gained tremendous attention this year, and that is the rise of EVs, and in particular, China's growing dominance in the industry. We'll specifically focus on why China has set itself apart in the race for EV dominance, learn more about the story of BYD, which is now China's preeminent EV maker, and discuss the broader repercussions of China's rapid rise in this industry.
Now, Sachin, I know you're really into planes, but I think you're also something of a car nerd. So I'd like you to elaborate a bit more on that.
That's right. Yeah, I am also a car nerd. As a kid, it would be one of my favorite traditions to go to the New York International Auto Show every year with my dad, and there we'd see all the new models of cars released by all the top companies. And I think when I was 4 or 5, I used to have a massive collection of toy cars scattered about our living room. So many, in fact, that it was difficult for people to walk around sometimes. So I'm still really interested in cars and a big fan.
All right. Well, that's perfect. I think that you're going to be pretty well suited to giving us an overview of the electric vehicles industry in that case. And I think that would be a good place to begin. So take it away.
Yeah, let's get started. So, electric vehicles have always been on the radar of auto manufacturers, as far back, in fact, as the 1800s, where some of the first automobiles ever created were actually electric powered. But for a variety of reasons, electric vehicles were determined to be impractical, and by the 1930s, they had been largely phased out in favor of vehicles powered by gas, your traditional internal combustion engines. Um, However, in that same time, there were advances in battery technology that were making it more and more feasible for large vehicles to be powered by batteries for more extended periods of time. And the key breakthrough here came in 1979 with the development of a rechargeable lithium cell of 4 volts. And the rechargeability of this battery was the basic prerequisite for battery powered e mobility.
Yep, we first saw that in things such as mobile phones and laptops, but in the early 2000s, this powerful battery technology began to be applied to cars. Because the power a vehicle gets from a battery comes in an entirely different form than liquid fuel. Batteries are, of course, solids. The motors for electric vehicles are also fundamentally different from the, gas-powered internal combustion engines used in many automobiles today. So electric vehicle motors essentially work as follows. A motor in an electric vehicle has two magnets which draw their energy from the rechargeable battery packs that are placed in the car. And one magnet is attached to the shaft that spins the car's wheels, while the other is attached to the housing around that shaft. Those magnets repel each other, and that force spins the shaft and in turn rotates the wheels. It's actually a very simple design. The key difficulty was always in getting rechargeable batteries that were cheap and light enough to power vehicles, which at this point they really finally are.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Electric vehicles actually have way fewer moving parts than internal combustion engine cars, and so maintenance is generally easier and more straightforward. And EVs have become massively more popular. In 2022, 16 to 18% of new cars sold around the world were electric. And by 2035, forecasters predict that EVs will account for almost 70% of global sales. That would amount to almost 60 to 70 million vehicles a year. Um, in fact, in 2035, the EU will ban the sale of new cars with internal combustion engines, and Western countries are preparing for a major shift away from internal combustion engines and towards EVs in a similar way.
That's fascinating. And I think that's why China's rise in electric vehicle manufacturing is so significant. China's automobile exports rose by 64% in 2023, which is mind-boggling. And much of that rise has been driven by its electric vehicles. So, just for context here, the annual sales of China's new energy cars, which include EVs and plug-in hybrids, are projected to grow by 22% in 2024 to reach 11 million vehicles. That's up from about 7.7 million currently. And, just another stat to underscore how much China is growing in the automobile sector. Just last year, China overtook Japan to become the world's biggest exporter of cars.
Wow, that's mind-boggling, actually. I always had the impression that Japan has some of the world's largest and most successful auto companies. Think of Toyota, Honda, and Lexus. And, I thought they were always the top exporters. So, what then would you say has contributed to China's meteoric rise in this space over the recent years?
Yeah, I mean, there are several reasons, and I think all of that might mean that in the same way that we, associate brands like Toyota and Honda with Japanese auto exports, there may be some Chinese firms that we soon will come to always associate with China's own auto exports. But looking at the reasons as to why China has been so successful here, the first is subsidies. The Chinese government has hugely subsidized the country's electric vehicles industry. And government handouts for electric and hybrid vehicles added up to $57 billion between 2016 and 2022. In fact, between 2015 and 2020, BYD, which is Sachin noted is probably one of China's most famous electric vehicle brands, received 4.3 billion from China's government via cheap loans and equity. The second reason that China has been so dominant in the electric vehicle space has to do with batteries, which China has already had a fair amount of market dominance in. Chinese companies supply 80% of the world's battery cells and account for nearly 60% of the EV battery market. And that basically has positioned China well to move from batteries production overall to producing vehicles that contain these batteries. The final reason that China has been successful, frankly, at manufacturing electric vehicles is that there are economies of scale in China. For one, China has a vast domestic market that allows local firms to sell to a really huge consumer base. More than that, though, China's manufacturing base in general is just massive. It's larger than anywhere else on Earth. And so when Chinese firms decide that they want to start making things, they have a very easy time mobilizing the resources to do exactly that. And now that they've streamlined the process for producing electric vehicles, they can really produce them at a scale that no other country is going to be able to match. As a result of all of that, the foreign firms that are selling cars in China are actually starting to get edged out pretty significantly. It used to be the case that foreign firms kind of dominated China's auto market, and that's really no longer the case. Volkswagen, which is a major German automaker, used to account for 20% of China's automobile sales, and that was as recently as 2020. But its share has since slumped to about 14%. And that's largely as a result of China's domestic demand now being met by Chinese firms. Another way of just underscoring how much China has risen in the electric vehicle space is to compare China's top electric vehicles firm, BYD, to Tesla, which is really the top Western firm that's making electric vehicles. BYD actually surpassed Tesla in selling the greater number of electric vehicles in the final quarter of 2023. BYD produced 526,000 electric vehicles, while Tesla produced just 484,000.
Wow, and that's a really important milestone, especially because BYD has been such an important seller of EVs in China. So I think it would be useful for us to just talk about its rise in a bit more detail here.
Yeah, absolutely. So BYD was founded in 1994 by Chinese battery engineer Wang Xuanfu, and somewhat optimistically, it said that BYD stands for Build Your Dream. But Xuanfu's ambitions didn't stop at batteries, which is where his training was. And he quickly moved BYD into the automobile space. So, unfortunately for BYD initially, it had a reputation for, to put it mildly, producing clunkers. Its cars weren't especially well regarded. But the company still showed some early promise. And Warren Buffett, for example, invested $230 million in the company in 2008, and that significantly increased BYD's cachet. At the same time, BYD also began to improve its car designs. In 2016, it hired Wolfgang Egger, who is a former engineer and car designer at Audi. And in turn, Egger brought on hundreds of Western engineers to BYD who helped to make BYD's car designs substantially more sleek and appealing to consumers. And that created a really potent combination for the company because China on its own was already so strong in producing batteries. And BYD was now producing cars that aesthetically attuned consumers wanted to consume. And as a result of that, BYD just started to really dominate the internal Chinese market. And at this point, it's starting to look to foreign markets as well. It's shipping thousands of cars to Europe, and China's vast shipyards are now working overtime to construct cargo ships that are specially designed to accommodate thousands of cars. So BYD is poised to become crucially important to global auto markets in the years ahead, and it's really poised to dominate the electric vehicles industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's fair to say that competitors in the Western world are somewhat scared. US President Joe Biden, for example, is now said to be considering quadrupling tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles up to 100%. And based on everything you said, you can see why. China has a very developed market for EVs and local brands dominate it. So, it will be tough for foreign companies and American automakers to gain market share there. And similarly, the technology of these cars is up to par with competition in the US, and if not better than many competitors. And so, part of that is a result of Chinese firms being a bit less risk averse, given the support that they do receive from their local government. And that means that they move faster to innovate in a larger way than their competitors. Um, so I think that the temptation will be for rich world policymakers to shield their car makers and protect them from the onslaught of cheaper Chinese EVs that could take over. With all that said, though, I think that there are some potential gains for the West that are worth talking about briefly. The first is cheaper cars and cheaper EVs. Vehicles are among people's biggest purchases, and they account for about 7% of American consumption. And having a supply of cheaper cars means more money for people to spend on other things. And at a time where real wages have been strained by high inflation, this could go a long way in spurring consumption in other parts of the economy. The second is having access to better technology. We just said that besides being cheap, Chinese cars have proven to have high quality and have especially smart technology that have created a new innovation in the market. And I think bringing that innovation to the U.S. market will help U.S. automakers also improve their technology to remain competitive. Um, Finally, I think that there's an environmental benefit as well. This speeds up the energy transition in many ways. EVs currently are much more expensive than gas guzzling cars, and while their costs have trended lower over the years, there's a noticeable benefit to bringing more cheap EVs to the US market. Just to quantify that, the cheapest EV sold in China by BYD costs around $12,000, and that compares with $39,000 for the cheapest Tesla model that's currently available in the US. So, embracing Chinese cars with lower prices could ease the transition to net zero emissions, and I think all that could be certainly a net positive.
Yeah. And Sachin, you're dead right that there are a lot of benefits associated with being able to access electric vehicles for cheaper prices. And yet, we need to reconcile that with the fact that, policymakers in both the United States and Europe seem quite alarmed by China's rise in electric vehicle manufacturing. And as you mentioned earlier, Joe Biden is strongly considering increasing tariffs on electric vehicles by a factor of four, specifically those electric vehicles coming from China. And I think that the reason for this is all really revolving around national security. Just at a broad level, I think there's a concern that electric vehicles from China, especially those with advanced sensors, could be collecting data that could eventually, go back into China and be used in some way by China's government. There's no evidence that that's happening right now, but it is an issue that policymakers have raised, and it's one that they've been concerned about with other Chinese firms that have tried to provide their services to Western countries. For example, Huawei, which was banned from pursuing contracts with European governments in 2020 due to concerns over espionage. Supply chain resiliency is another reason that these Western countries are concerned about China's rapid rise in EV manufacturing. Both the United States and Europe have been making efforts to manufacture more green energy and renewable energy technologies domestically. And if China becomes, the world's unrivaled and dominant manufacturer of electric vehicles, that's of course going to make it harder for the United States and its allies to produce those same kind of technologies at home. And so just by virtue of, their desire to have domestic manufacturing, they may be opposed to allowing China to completely dominate the electric vehicles market.
Yeah, that's all really interesting, Ben. And, it seems to be a real tension between economics and trust between governments. And I'm sure that these conversations will be ongoing well into the future. And, it seems like China's EV industry isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So we'll see how this evolves in the years ahead.
I think that's right. It's really going to be fascinating to see where things stand a year from now on this, just because events are moving so quickly here.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, for that conversation. And thank you all for joining us. Next week, we will stay in East Asia and cover some of the major demographic transitions that many countries are now experiencing and talk more about what it all means for the region. So we will see you then. Thanks for listening to Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views in this podcast are our own and are not reflective of any institutions that we're associated with. They should not be considered investment advice. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and share with a friend or family member. We'll see you again next time.